for his last journey. Special Air Mission 41 headed to Washington, D.C. after a departure ceremony in Houston, Texas, with the Bush family in attendance, which you've watched live here on Fox News. The former president's remains will lie in state at the Capitol Rotunda beginning this evening until a state funeral at the National Cathedral on Wednesday. President Trump has declared a national day of mourning on that day. This is Outnumbered. I'm Harris Faulkner. Here today, Melissa Francis, host of Kennedy on Fox Business Network, Kennedy herself, Fox News analyst, co-host of Benson and Harf on Fox News Radio, Marie Harf, and in the center seat, Matt Schlapp, chairman of the American Conservative Union and former White House political director for President George W. Bush. Wow, it is a heavy moment, but I hear so much joy from the family members and people who knew the former president. You were joyful as you sat down. It is a point of celebration for those of you who have known him and loved him.
Well, when someone dies who's lived a big, great, full life, and when that person has the deep faith that George H.W. Bush had, when they die, the greatest gift they give us is we're not worried about where they're going. Nobody's worried about that.
These are live pictures, by the way. We're going to stay with Air Force One for as long as we can. We know that that special mission landed this weekend and awaited the remains of the president. The family gathered today, and now the beautiful occasion of rarefied air. As a former pilot, he has seen rarefied air throughout his life, the youngest in the Navy at the time. We want to give him a civilian salute from this couch today. Kennedy, your thoughts?
I think it's really nice how he stuck the landing. And you know when John Scott was talking about the quote he gave on his 90th birthday when he went skydiving instead of drooling in the corner, it really is inspirational. And it's so tough for a family to lose. You know, you think of his children losing both parents within a year.
Yeah.
You know, and especially to have such public events. My heart really goes out to them, but the nice thing is it's rare that we really pause for a moment to sum up someone's life. We were able to do that in April for Mrs. Bush and now for President Bush, and we get to dive into the aspects of his life that are not often talked about, including, as Matt pointed out in his beautiful article, his time in the Navy as a young man. And also, you know, think about it, he was the CIA director under Gerald Ford, in addition to being the U.S. ambassador to the UN.
So Air Force One is out of frame now, and so we know that in about 3.5 hours or a little bit less, he will land in Washington, D.C., and we will pick up our coverage from there in terms of being able to see more parts of the journey. But we'll continue the conversation here. Your thoughts?
Matt, you made a great point about the dignity with which he lived his life after his presidency. And, you know, just sort of the joyful embrace of life where he action-packed, very active, but not looking back, not holding on to that, I'm still the president. Just the dignity and the love of life. And he taught so many great lessons to the people around him. Here's one, Vice President Dan Quayle, here's what he had to say.
A lot of folks, you know, they ask me, well, what's the legacy? I said, you know, that's a tough question. Historians will sort that out. But in my view, his legacy, Maria, was accomplishments. He got things done. When he left office, the economy was growing at, what, 5-6%. You know, the Berlin Wall came down. Eastern and Central Europe freed from the yoke of communism. So many things in a short period of time, and the domestic front as well.
Hearing from the former vice president on with Maria Bartiromo yesterday, you know, one of his accomplishments, because he had to, was working with Democrats on the Hill, because he didn't have the bicameral leadership among one party that we see with our current president and have seen in years since.
It really feels like the end of an era in American politics. And I felt a similar way when we said goodbye to John McCain a few months ago, that these were men who served in the military. Many politicians today haven't, just because of the timing, right? Who volunteered, who were willing to work across the aisle, who were gracious in victory and defeat. I mean, if you look at what George H.W. Bush said to Bill Clinton when he was giving him advice when he was taking office, this dignity and class that he had in that office and after, I think it feels like an era of American politics that many of us miss. We wish politics was more like this today. And I think this is another reason, on top of the personal sadness, that I'm sad for our country that he's gone.
Well, a lot of people think we can get back to that, and I remain ever hopeful no matter where civility is now. He is a reminder of what that can look like.
Absolutely.
Be sure to keep it right here on Fox News at 5 p.m. Eastern. Brett Baer and Martha McCallum will anchor our special coverage of the ceremony in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda where George H.W. Bush will lie in state. Leaders of the House and Senate will pay their respects, and Vice President Pence will also be there. He's scheduled to speak, actually. So you can watch all that live coverage right here on Fox. And we'll have much more this hour as well on the life and legacy of the former President George H.W. Bush. This was moments ago as Air Force One began the flight to Washington, D.C., set to arrive 3.5 hours, now less, at Joint Base Andrews. And a Bush spokesperson tweeted this touching image of the president's service dog, Sully, lying next to the president's casket on Sunday, along with the caption, "Mission complete." Hashtag remembering 41. Stay close.
Time, anywhere. Fox News.
U.S. stocks surging today on news of a ceasefire in the trade war between the U.S. and China. President Trump announcing the deal after a dinner with the president of China at the G20. President Trump talking up the truce on the way back from Argentina aboard Air Force One.
It'll have an incredibly positive impact on farming, meaning agriculture, industrial products, computers. And what I'd be doing is holding back on tariffs. China will be opening up, and China will be buying massive amounts of product from us, including agricultural from our farmers.
The president again touting the deal this morning, tweeting, "My meeting in Argentina with President Xi of China was an extraordinary one. Relations with China have taken a big leap forward. Very good things will happen. We are dealing from great strength, but China likewise has much to gain if and when a deal is completed. Level the field." And while both sides say key details have to be hammered out, Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin is confident we are seeing the outlines of a final deal. All right. Steve Mnuchin, I want to go on. He said there were very, very specific items. We've been working on this for a long time, for a year and a half. We got down to brass tacks. Steve Mnuchin is no joke. I mean, he has negotiated many, many, many very detailed deals over his lifetime, and he really understands finance well. This is a hopeful sign.
This is, and for all of the critics that Trump's trade rhetoric would never be matched with a kind of recalibration of these major relationships. We saw it with Mexico first, and then Canada had to go along kicking and screaming, and he really did renegotiate NAFTA. And now you have America's #1 economic foe and national security foe looking at Donald Trump, and I think they look at him and they say, I think he's actually serious about wanting us to actually have reciprocal trade. So that's all got to get written down. But these are massive steps.
Well, Steve Mnuchin makes it sound like a lot of it is already written down. I mean, they've already worked into the details, Harris.
Well, and in fact, we heard just a little bit ago on Fox Business Network with Larry Kudlow, the National Senior Advisor of Economics, and he said that to that point, in the next 90 days, this 90-day ceasefire that we'll see, there are some things that are going to get done that are big. And they would only know that if they had already talked about these things. But I have a quick question for you, Marie. So Democrats have a choice to make here. Are they going to let this deal go through, or are they going to try to, get in there and do something? Same with the USMCA.
Yeah, on China, there is no deal yet. So those brass tacks that you mentioned that Steve Mnuchin's been talking about, those are all really important. And I don't think we can make a decision on any deal or support for that until we actually see them. Those are really tough details. They will not be a cakewalk working them out, certainly with the Chinese. And there are still significant tariffs on. They're not going up, but we still have significant tariffs on right now. We will have to see those details. The devil will be all in them. There's a political question, Harris, you asked, though, about whether Congress will approve the new NAFTA, the updated NAFTA.
Right.
And I think there will be some tough questions asked. Ultimately, I think they will, because it's actually not a drastic change from NAFTA.
On a factual point,
it's not actually substantively.
But sticking on this one, a factual difference, though, on November 1st, 1,500 tariffs from China, they lowered on their end as a sign of concession. So we actually have already seen movement and progress before this, Kennedy.
No, it's critical for them to lower these tariffs, and it would be great if we could have barrier-free trade with China. We still have yet to see how they're addressing some of the intellectual property theft, which, you know, really is, in my mind, the most critical issue. And in some ways, the tariffs are secondary. The markets love it, though. And if the president wants the markets to go up, let's free up the trade.
Mnuchin mentioned that specifically, that they're working on that. So we'll see. All right, the battle for the border wall continues as the countdown is on to fund the government and avoid a shutdown. Whether the president would be open to compromise and why the issue is causing tension among Democrats.
For $5 billion to fund the border wall system. The president tweeted this: "We would save billions of dollars if the Democrats would give us the votes to build the wall. Either way, people will not be allowed into our country illegally!" Exclamation point. "We will close the entire southern border if necessary. Also, stop the drugs." So my big question, and I'm so glad you're here, why haven't, up until now, Republicans helped this president get the funding for his wall? We can blame Democrats all you want, but you had a situation where he didn't get the votes among those Republicans, even in the House.
Yeah, this shouldn't be shocking news, but there's a lot of Republicans who've been in Congress a long time who view the Donald Trump agenda as a bit of an indictment on their failure to solve problems. And one of the things that's happening on funding of the border wall is a lot of folks believe that they're either not for the wall or they don't want to admit the fact that our immigration policy in the southern border has been a complete failure.
And let me get this straight. So they want to fail twice then.
Yeah.
So they failed and they didn't get it done, and now they don't want to push forward, because you could do like a deal with DACA. I mean, you could, there was some room.
There's a deal to be had if Democrats want to actually give Donald Trump something to sign, but he does have problems within his own party. It's a very fair question.
But see, I think that's where the deal is to be had, because there is something that both sides want. There's a lot that both sides can't live with. They have to give and take, but I think he has a better chance with Democrats. It's the Republicans, I agree with you, who failed him.
Because we're having a change in the coalition in politics. Sometimes, you know, they call it, you know, that there's a new group and a new way of looking at politics. And the Republican Party as a monolith, I now think we have a conservative community, a Republican community, and a Trump community. There's mostly overlap, but not complete overlap. And it's a lot of change, makes a lot of people uncomfortable. I'm good with it because I think we need to change.
I think it's fantastic because I think this two-party system, it is so outdated.
Fossilized.
And it serves almost no one. And the president is really the first president who's realizing that things are broken up into coalitions. You know, he had Jeff Sessions as his attorney general, but he was also talking about, you know, pretty radical criminal justice reform at the same time, which is also a darling subject of progressives. So if you can take these coalitions in areas where you need them, instead of just us versus them, one team versus the other, Northwestern versus Ohio State.
Woo! Right. And the Buckeyes won that game. Thank you for bringing that up.
Oh, my goodness. But yeah, I mean, I see you nodding along as Kennedy and Matt are talking, and I totally get why we're at the point now where the president might be on the precipice of a deal with Democrats. The big question is, how do they want to define their legacy on immigration? Because it isn't just Republicans who've done not more than they should or what they could. Democrats are guilty, too. They had a supermajority and couldn't get it done.
Both sides have gone to the extremes on immigration. And I think that my party, the Democrats, are right now also going through some conversations about how they want to lead the House. And we have the progressives that won in this election, and there are many of them who have certain feelings on immigration. But a lot of the reason Democrats took the majority were moderates from places like the suburbs of conservative cities, from the Midwest, I mean, Michigan, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, Kansas. You can go around the country. These are not abolish ICE Democrats. So we're doing some own figuring out in our own party here. I do think Democrats will support a 2-week stopgap measure to push funding of the government right up to Christmas. But if we're sitting here in 2 weeks and everyone wants to go home for Christmas,
anybody?
Well, no one wants to fight over it this week, which I understand.
So why don't they make a deal then? If they don't want to fight, why don't they sit down like adults and make a deal?
Because Congress,
it's Congress.
Because Congress is so dysfunctional. The only time you'll ever see a deal is when they are absolutely have their back back to,
Yeah.
unfortunately,
but this is
the wall.
it. But this is it. I mean, this is it. Republicans are now not going to control the House. How much more against the wall can you get?
Well, look, I think the president is serious about wanting his $5 billion, but what he's more serious than anything for the wall, what he's more serious than anything else is, and hopefully we can all agree on this. How about this? Follow the immigration laws. They're actually pretty extensive and complicated, and we simply don't follow them because judges come in and they give people like a lightning bolt a reason why they have to be able to come into the country around the laws.
And if they're too
that has to
complex,
stop.
then simplify them.
Exactly.
But that's the job of Congress.
Right.
All right. Wow, we got it all figured out. Kinda. President Trump's attorney, Rudy Giuliani, will with more harsh words for the special counsel. The president is not holding back either. And one person who could be central to the investigation is filing a criminal complaint against Robert Mueller, saying he wanted him to lie. What it could mean for the investigation, we'll talk about it.
President Trump's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, slamming Robert Mueller, accusing the special counsel of unethical tactics and intimidation after the president's former attorney, Michael Cohen, pled guilty to lying to Congress. This all comes weeks after Trump's legal team sent written answers to Mueller's questions for the president. Meanwhile, conservative author Jerome Corsi, an associate of former Trump advisor Roger Stone, filed a criminal complaint today alleging Mueller's team tried to coerce him into lying under oath. Stone echoed that anti-Mueller sentiment over the weekend.
There's no circumstance under which I would testify against the president because I'd have to bear false witness against him. I'd have to make things up, and I'm not going to do that.
Stone and Corsi now figure in the Russia probe amid reports that Stone asked Corsi for information on WikiLeaks' initial dump of hacked DNC emails. Stone denies that, but incoming House Intel Chairman Adam Schiff says Stone's communications between him and Corsi suggest otherwise.
The emails that you read to him, those exchanges with Corsi, which I think he provided to the press, the substance of those emails are inconsistent with his testimony before our committee. The mere existence of those emails are inconsistent with his testimony before our committee. That testimony really needs to be provided to the special counsel for consideration of whether perjury charges are warranted.
So, Matt, Roger Stone and Jerome Corsi both have a checkered past with their political involvement. I'm trying to be very diplomatic here. And clearly there appears to be some communications with WikiLeaks. That's what it looks like special counsel is looking at. What do you make of this latest development with both of those men?
Marie, this is really simple. He has had over a year. He has had subpoena power and all the money in the world to go after anybody and get them under oath. And he doesn't have a case. He has some facts he believes that point towards maybe a conclusion like you're talking, but all he is doing is he is taking the dirt he's gotten on people like Cohen, and he's squeezing them to get everything he can out of them. We talked about criminal justice reform. I tell you, coming out of this special counsel, I think what people want is they want a timed limit on these investigations. They want a budget limit on it. And look, we just had a big nationwide campaign. Show me the Democratic ad, the 30-second ad on Russian collusion. They didn't run it because you know what? The American people are over this. There is no case here. We are exhausted. Show us what you got, put your cards on the table, and let's move on as a country.
I agree. I want to actually see all of Mueller's cards. We're in agreement on that. Harris, if it turns out, focusing on Roger Stone and Jerome Corsi here, if it turns out that they were working with WikiLeaks or they knew when the hacked DNC emails were coming before anyone else, that seems like a kind of a big deal.
So for them and their legal process, absolutely it would be and will be if that's the case. But, you know, the biggest question, I think, that is still out there has to do with what the president knew and when he knew it. And you have so many...
That's very Watergate.
...shady questions, right? Shady people, rather, where these questions are involved, that it's hard to kind of know where you are. So we've got to wait to see what he's pieced together. But just take for a moment of all the characters that we know. And I would ask you this, because I know you do polling for CPAC, because I asked you about it. Are you
calling me a character, I hope?
No. But do the American people care about that? Do they? What do they? Because you've done some polling. What resonates with voters?
Well, obviously, the whole Russia collusion thing doesn't resonate with voters at all because nobody ran on it just weeks ago. Second second of all, what people want is they want to know that if somebody did something wrong, that there's transparency. And I think the number one thing, the reason why Mueller's numbers are so poor in almost every poll, Harris, is because he is almost looks like he's playing a game. He's blackmailing people into saying things and doing things because they might have had a scummy part of their past.
Well, they're
that's
lying
not the American
along the way.
way.
Some of them that helps
I don't want to
in the process.
To a brand new hour of America's Newsroom, I'm Sandra Smith.
And I'm John Scott, in for Bill Hemmer. War hero, public servant, president, and great American. President Bush, 41, is about to make his final journey to Washington, D.C. He will lie in state at the U.S. Capitol. Matt Schlapp remembering President Bush earlier on America's Newsroom.
He taught the American people that it's not your job title or your resume that make you who you are. It's the gifts God gives you and how you use them and how you impact others. I think he impacted more people across the globe than maybe any political leader we've ever had.
Fox team coverage. Britt Hume will be joining us in just a moment, but we begin with Casey Stiegel live from Houston this morning. Casey?
And Sandra, good morning. We are anticipating this to start happening any time, really, because we've been getting notes from the pool producer. In other words, the person out here handling and sort of coordinating this coverage for all of the networks, telling us that the family members have been told to be ready about 15 minutes earlier than expected. So we're starting to see more activity picking up back here. We showed you this picture about 30 minutes ago in the last hour of America's Newsroom, but we want to show it to you one more time because you see the hearse right back there, and there has been a lot of activity, members of active military walking around. You have a very heavy police presence here with the Houston Police Department. This is the Lewis and Sons funeral home. You know, we stood in this exact spot just about 8 months ago. This was the same funeral home that handled the arrangements for former First Lady Barbara Bush. But what we're going to see happen here about 10:35 Eastern, 9:35 local is when we were told that we would see the pallbearers emerge from the chapel carrying the flag-draped casket. And those pallbearers, by the way, 6 current members of the former president's Secret Service detail. And so they are supposed to emerge from the chapel carrying the casket to the hearse. And speaking of that casket draped in the U.S. flag, boy, talk about a picture that has broken the internet. It's hard to even look at without welling up. Look at this picture. Talk about man's best friend, Sully. That is the former president's service dog, a Labrador that he got once his beloved Barbara passed away earlier this year. And this dog can do everything. He has his own Instagram page, 33 different commands, can open doors, can pick things up for you. And this has been the president's companion, we understand, just man's best friend. And that dog not leaving his side, laid out right there on the floor of the funeral home in front of the president's casket. So a lot of moving parts to this. Once the casket is loaded into the hearse at the funeral home here, then that is when the motorcade is going to begin, and it will leave this location and it will head to Ellington Field, where Air Force One is waiting, the plane that's used as Air Force One, and that is where it will be loaded up. There will be a small ceremony there, and then wheels up, headed for join Andrews Air Force Base.
And today,
so
because
we'll stay here, we'll bring it to you.
And today, because Air Force One will not be carrying the president, that will be Special Air Mission 41 carrying the former president. Thank you very much, Casey Stiegel.
Yeah.
Joining us now for more on the life and legacy of President Bush, Bush 41, Fox News senior political analyst Britt Hume. I know you have met a lot of presidents, covered a lot of presidents. What are your memories of President George Herbert Walker Bush, Britt?
Well, I have many because I covered his campaign in 1980, and then again in 1988, and then I covered his presidency as a White House correspondent. And you know, he was a gregarious man, friendly to reporters, easy to be around. And I think my favorite story about him is actually one I never knew until earlier this year. And it was told to me by Dr. Charles Neblett, a very, very good friend of the family, with whom the Bushes, through the years, were accustomed to watching the election returns with at their home. And picture the scene, John. It's 1988, election night, and then Vice President Bush and Mrs. Bush are at the Neblitz home to have dinner and watch the election returns. And the election returns came in, and the word came, and the call was made that George H.W. Bush was going to be the next president of the United States. His vice presidential motorcade was waiting outside for him to whisk him across town to the George Brown Convention Center, where the victory celebration was waiting for him. And his first act was to help clear the dinner dishes. To me, John, to me, that is so like him. And I posted that yesterday on Twitter, and a guy up in Canada, who I guess is a hunting guide, posted a photograph of President Bush on a hunting trip, in which he's helping to carry the coolers full of the lunch that had been brought into these guys out in the wilderness by helicopter. And the writer of this tweet said that he was the only one who helped these guys. But there he is, you see him and his hip waders, walking along, helping to bring and that's really kind of how he was. I mean, for a man who grew up in such privilege and served in office at such high levels, he was in many ways an extremely polite, considered, and humble guy. And that is the quality about him that I think those of us who knew him a long time remember so vividly.
Great stories, and if you'll stick with us, we want to get some more of them in just a moment, but somebody else has some interesting stories about the former president. We want to go to that now. Sandra?
Joining us now by phone is President Bush's former right-hand man, Vice President Dan Quayle. Mr. Vice President, thank you. It's an honor to have you on the program this morning, sir. And I know
Good morning.
Yes, good morning to you. If you could look back at your time spent with the former president, a man you came to know so well and worked so closely with.
Yes, I was very blessed. One of the real benefits that I had compared to other vice presidents is that George Bush had been vice president for 8 years. He served Ronald Reagan very effectively, very loyally. But he also knew the good things about being vice president and the not so good things about being vice president. So that was very helpful to me. But as all your folks have said, and Britt was on there earlier, he was a man who had a deep caring for the people that weren't as fortunate as he was. But on the other side of that, I know a lot of people have talked about his humility and modesty and things like that. But he was also inside very tough. I saw him worked with him during the Gulf War. He was the toughest and the most focused of everybody. And you look at it throughout his career, I mean, he was always a winner. So there was a certain toughness, but he had great respect for other people. He had a love of life. He loved, obviously, his wife and his family. And he was, just to put it succinctly, absolutely the best.
And together you faced so many challenges. What was the biggest challenge to the former president during his term?
Well, on foreign policy, he knew exactly what he wanted to do. And he was clearly the very decisive leader. I mean, we were all around giving him advice that he would listen, but he knew what to do, and he knew how to do it. He knew the world. He knew the world better than anybody else. He knew all the leaders. His biggest challenge probably came on the domestic policy. He was in Congress for 2 terms, and I was in the House and the Senate, and we talked a lot about dealing with the Congress. But that was probably the biggest challenge. I remember after being successful in Desert Storm, we said, okay, now what are we going to do about the economy? And it was a challenge. But he had a lot of accomplishments. The Clean Air Act, the Disabilities Act, budget. We funded the government during a very divisive time. And don't forget, we had a Democrat Congress. We had Democrat control of the House and the Senate. So in those days, we reached across the aisle and worked with the Democrats as hard as we worked with our fellow Republicans.
Of course, he promised during the convention, read my lips, no new taxes, and then signed a tax increase, perhaps to mollify the Democrats who were running the House and the Senate. Is that what cost him re-election, in your view?
Well, it didn't help, but no, I don't think so. Look, that situation, just to put it in perspective, we're going in to Desert Storm. It was the fall that Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait. We were focused on what we're going to do there. He had to keep the government going. He knew he had to compromise. He did compromise. He knew that it was going to not be helpful to him in his re-election because, that very, dramatic moment at the convention on, read my lips statement. But I think what really probably was the nail and the final nail in the coffin was Ross Perot got 19% of the vote. And here is a Republican businessman from the president's home state garnering 19% of the vote around the country. That's very difficult to overcome, and we didn't.
Mr. Vice President, if you could take a moment, finally, to look back at the man that you came to know so well as a family man. We're remembering him as the former president and a former military man this morning, among so many other things. But it seems, hearing the stories from those who knew him best, he was truly a family man. As it was, he was a father and a beloved husband.
Well, let me just give you one little anecdote that will stay with Marilyn and I as long as we live. This was after the election in 1992 that we had lost. And a couple of days afterwards, my 3 children received a handwritten note from the President of the United States telling them that how proud he was to serve with their father. That was so touching and so revealing in a time that, he obviously wasn't feeling the best. He'd just been defeated. He took time out to console my children. We'll never forget that.
Wow, that's a remarkable story and a special one as well. Former Vice President Dan Quayle, it's wonderful to have you on the program this morning, sir. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Let's get back to our conversation now with Britt Hume. Britt, our brain room does such wonderful research. Every president makes history in his own way. But it had been since 1836, Martin Van Buren, when a sitting vice president was elected to the presidency to follow the man he'd been serving with. George H.W. Bush did that, and it was, as has been pointed out, one term, but it was a consequential one term.
It was a consequential one term, and it has struck me many times, John, that it was often said of Bush that he really didn't have vision of where he wanted to take the country, that he lacked what he himself used to refer to as the vision thing, which he would say somewhat dismissively. In fact, however, I think it's correct to say that what happened on his watch was vision that had been held by many people in leadership positions for many years came to fruition with the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, a moment of great opportunity and hope, but also one of great peril. It was not guaranteed that would end well. It was not guaranteed that chaos wouldn't erupt in Europe as a result of that. And President Bush's sense of things was to be very careful in how he reacted to that. I'll never forget the day the Berlin Wall came down. I was there at the White House, and my CBS News colleague Leslie Stahl was banging on about where is he? Why isn't he out telling us? Why isn't he reflecting the joy of the nation and indeed of the Western world that this has happened? And Bush steadfastly refused to come out and say a word. He was not in any way going to appear to rub it in or to be gloating over the victory of the West over the Soviet Union. And he later was able to develop with Mikhail Gorbachev a strong working relationship. His relationship with Helmut Kohl in Germany was a huge factor in bringing about the reunification of Germany. I noticed that Angela Merkel in the last couple of days has called him one of the fathers of German reunification. So he was in many ways, with all his diplomatic experience, his personal friendships with world leaders across the globe, these things came into play at the right moment with him, and he turned out to be just the guy to manage this victory, which was very important. And then, of course, later, as Dan Quayle has noted, we had the Gulf War, and his ability to string together this huge coalition of countries, to include even Syria, then governed by an utterly vicious dictator named Hafez al-Assad, He even got him to play in the thing to keep it from being to get some Muslim countries into the coalition, which he managed to do. And that, of course, that war was a total success, a complete walkover. It lasted only a matter of days, with very light casualties on the coalition side. So, I think he turned out to be the right man for the challenges that met him when he was in the office.
Brett, it's Sandra. Finally, if I could show...
Hi, Sandra.
And hello. I wanted to show this exchange with Chris Wallace and the former president about sending troops into combat and what that was like.
It's got to be the hardest thing for any president to send troops into combat.
Oh, it's the toughest decision a president makes, no question. Nothing compares with it. When you send somebody else's kid, somebody else's son, somebody else's daughter, whatever it is, into harm's way.
And on a personal level, how do you live with it?
Well, you, with all respect, you pray, and you rely heavily on a team of experts, but in the final analysis, you live with the decision. And sometimes things worked out great, and sometimes I was very worried they wouldn't. When you suit up to be president, that goes with the territory.
Remarkable to look back at that exchange, Brett.
Yeah, and it's I so well remember, Sandra, and it was Thanksgiving of the year of the invasion of Kuwait by Iraqi forces, and the United States and its coalition partners were massing forces in the region. We had bases out in Saudi Arabia to defend Saudi Arabia, and from which to mount an attack to liberate Kuwait, and there were ships at sea. And the president went over at Thanksgiving to be with some of the troops. And those of us who covered him had watched him very carefully in the run-up to this. And a lot of people thought he was bluffing, that all of this was just a big bluff to get Saddam Hussein to turn tail and leave Kuwait. Those of us who were watching him so carefully during that Thanksgiving was out first on a ship to do a Thanksgiving dinner, and then out in a remote base in Saudi Arabia. Awful place, sand in your hair, sand everywhere, outdoors. And you could see and hear in his voice the emotion he felt about being among these soldiers. We didn't know for sure how that war would turn out. We knew the Allied forces were going to win, but we had no idea, nor did he, how many casualties the United States forces would take. And he's out there among these men and women, and he didn't know how many of them would come home. And he was obviously clearly emotional. This was not the behavior of a man who was bluffing. And the thought you heard reflected in that exchange with Chris, I think, was exemplified in the way he behaved and acted and seemed that weekend.
Amazing stories and great perspective. Brett, thank you.
We're going to take a live look now at the Houston Funeral Home, where we await the departure of the casket that will carry the body of former President George H.W. Bush, heading to Washington one last time as America says a final farewell. Tributes to the 41st president continue to pour in.
And our friendship just got better. And
okay, so I went down, I was sitting down there and just kind of taking it all in. And in walks Dad. So Andy had told Dad that I was down there, and he walks in. I said, "Mr. President, welcome." He said, "Thank you, Mr. President." And that's pretty much all that was said for a while. And it was a very profound moment for me.
That's former President George W. Bush reflecting back on the day he was sworn into office. His father, President George Herbert Walker Bush, will be laid to rest this week. In just a few moments, the casket will be leaving the Houston Funeral Home to board a special flight to Washington, D.C., where he will be lying in state in the Capitol Rotunda until Wednesday. Wyoming Senator John Barrasso shares his memories of the elder Bush. He remembers him as a kind and generous man, saying, "Everyone got a smile, everyone got a handshake." Senator Barrasso is our headliner today. He joins us from Capitol Hill. Your memories, Senator, of President Bush 41, so similar to what Britt Hume just described, a very gregarious and friendly man, but it seems that sometimes that did not translate to the American people at large, and that may be what cost him re-election. Do you agree? And if so, why was that?
Well, it's interesting, and I think it translated very well to anyone he was with in person, but maybe not as well on television. Brett was just talking about that run up to the war against Saddam Hussein and the troops at Thanksgiving. One of my operating room nurses from Casper, Wyoming, was a soldier on the ground there when President Bush was there on that Thanksgiving. And she said just being with him, you gained confidence because you knew that he was in control, so you were in control. So one-on-one and in person and with groups, with individuals. I saw it when I was with him in Wyoming, in Casper, as well as in Jackson Hole. He was, a man of great courage and great character. But you're absolutely right. It was much better in person than it was sometimes on television.
Speaking of courage and maturity, I mean, an 18-year-old pilot in the U.S. Navy, perhaps the youngest pilot in World War II, shot down and